Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming along to the University of York for this afternoon session on adventures in time, space and television. I am not the star of the show by any stretch of the means. That's my friend Simon here, who'll be with you in a minute. So don't worry, I'll be off the stage in pretty short order. I'd like to welcome you. There will be chance for you to ask questions as well at the end. So without any further ado, we'll get going. So I'm going to stand here first and talk about what we are here for today, which is the Terrance and David Whitaker archives, which are two of our collections at the Borthwick Institute for Archives. And my job here at the University of York is Keeper of Archives and Research Collections, hence why I'm stood here right now. But I thought, before we dived into it too far, we'd just go through, give you a quick highlight of what is in the archives of the writers Terrance and David Whitaker. One of the first questions, and I'm assuming this is an audience who knows who both either Terrance or David Whitaker are. So this, we'll get into the context a bit later on. But one of the questions is, why are they at York? Which is a fair question. Neither of them have particularly deep connections to York, and that's because the University of York at the Borthwick Institute for Archives, we've been collecting the archives of 20th century writers since 2005. There's a sample of them on the screen there. If anyone wants their writer's bingo card, if you can shout house, you've got the Goons, you've got Miles Kington, Johnny Spate, Barry Tuck, Sir Alan Ayckbourn, Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, and Lawrence Marks and Maurice Gran, amongst many others. And it's through those collections that we come to be here today, but it's by a bit of a strange and possibly unexpected route. We acquired the archive of Frankie Howard in 2021. God, I was young and full of promise then. Look at that. Years of not being kind. And what I'm holding there is actually Frankie Howard's travelling suitcase that was stuffed full of his personal scripts. So the archive of Frankie Howard came to us in 2021, which led to us acquiring the archive of one of Frankie Howard's producers, which is the guy in the middle there called Ernest Maxson, with two undocumented performers who, never went on to do anything again, Morecambe-wise, obviously. So that came to the archive of one of his producers, Ernest Maxson, in 2022, which led to us encountering Simon as you were doing some research on David Whitaker, who was a friend of Ernest Maxson. Now then, it's not obviously a massive leap to understand that throughout this, and again, huge thanks to Simon for making those connections, led us to the archive of Terrance, of which more in due course. So what's in David Whitaker's archive? It's quite small as archives go. It's only about 6 boxes, mostly professional papers, but there's a small amount of personal material and correspondence. I would warn, give the context warning at the start, there's not a lot of Doctor Who in there, but I think that's one of the strengths of the archive, is it shows the breadth of David's career, which we'll hear about in a minute. Got an unpublished novel, and I think one of my favourite pieces in the archive, and in fact amongst all our archives at the Borthwick, which span the mid-11th century to the present day in 60-plus countries, is this genuine documented letter from Doctor Who themselves to a young fan. It's a real one. No one else has one like that. Just happened to write it on David Whitaker's typewriter while he was visiting. So there we go. That leads to the archive of Terrance, and there is Terrance. And I would just want to show this picture. It's one of the most meaningful pictures I've ever taken. This is a picture I took in Terrance's office when I went to see the papers almost exactly a year ago. And being in there is very close to a religious experience for me. I don't often go wobbly in the presence of new archives, but this one I absolutely did. Terrance's archive is much bigger. It's just about under 70 boxes of material. It's personal and professional and documents how you write and to use the word, possibly the struggle of writing. Not just Doctor Who, there's all his children's books, and he was producer of BBC classic serials, different aspects to his career, mostly mid-70s to mid-1990s, but there are earlier and later works, scripts, source materials, for instance, that were used as for the Doctor Who novelisations, and there are also appointment diaries and a lot more. What's not in the archive, of course, is work when he was working as BBC staff. I'm sorry, there are no missing episodes in there. I did check 3 times for film canisters and found none. But I did have the moment of reading the now discovered Dalek Masterplan episodes, because he had those in his collection. So that was quite nice. Some scripts that he wrote for Doctor Who aren't there in much any reflective journals or much about actors in the show, but that's doing it down. There is a heck of a lot in there. And we know about these, and this is the jumping off point really onto you, Simon, which is the work and the writings of Terrance. I will get out of the way, but if you would like to explore the archives at any point in time, you're more than welcome to do so. There are lists of the contents of each box available online for you to enjoy and explore now, and I have a brilliant ability, a career aspiration fulfilled, that I can search in my own archive catalogue for the word Dalek and get results. Simon, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon. I am Simon, and I write books and comics and audio plays and magazine features and anything else I can do about Doctor Who, but also about the history of television. And this is basically me as a kid. This is what's in my head most of the time when I'm writing, to try and get across that sense of excitement and wonder that I felt as a kid watching Doctor Who. As Gary said, this is a talk about Doctor Who, but it's a talk about the archives of these two writers who are not necessarily household names. But if you know Doctor Who, and if you don't know Doctor Who, most of it is up on iPlayer. You have no excuses. There's homework after this. There will be an exam. But their names appear a lot on Doctor Who. And from their archives, we can learn some of what they did, some of why Doctor Who works, some of what they brought to it. So as Gary said, the archives of these two writers are now here in York. Here's just a sample of them. Here's Gary's lovely display of various things where students can come in, look at them. Terrance's widow, very, very keen that his paperwork, which was filling that office, that picture that Gary showed of the office, that was after they'd tidied up. And it was wall-to-wall boxes, books, papers. When I was there, 3 rooms full of his papers. And she was like, I just want this to be useful and for people to have access to it. And I'm very grateful to Gary for making that happen. So let's talk about who these people are. David Whitaker, he was the story editor of the first year of Doctor Who, so that's in the top left, that's from the first episode. He then, as a freelance writer, wrote more episodes of Doctor Who in the 1960s than anybody else. So top right, that's the first time a companion changes, the lineup of the regulars changes, that was him. Bottom left, first time the Doctor changes, that was him, that's the Power of the Daleks, and he's still writing into the colour era with John Pertwee. Here, for your interest, is the stories that he is the credited writer on. So that's 40 episodes of Doctor Who. He was also the story editor of the first 51 episodes, or 53, depending how you count, because 2 were not broadcast. He wrote the first Doctor Who novelisation in 1964, and then another one. He wrote 2 annuals. The first Doctor Who book is the Dalek book from 1964. He wrote Dalek comics for 2 years, a stage play, and a movie. And you may notice there's a bit of a theme in this stuff, a bit of a Dalek-y theme, because David was very closely associated with Terry Nation, the man who created the Daleks. Terry Nation pitched an idea to David Whitaker, a story editor. The BBC, the head of the BBC drama department, Sidney Newman, had said, under no circumstances must my new TV show that I've invented, which is a very serious science fiction show that will be educational, there must be no bug-eyed monsters. And David Whitaker went, yeah, but we've had the most amazing, exciting story about frogs who drive tanks. And it made Doctor Who a hit. And David had the sense to go, not only will we have frogs in tanks, but we'll have monsters. We'll make this a monster show. And and more or less from that point, as a result of David spotting that the Daleks worked, they worked out how to do Doctor Who and how to make it a big hit. And a bit to my surprise, when I was researching David's life, there's a chapter on him in the history of the KLF, the electronic band, history by John Higgs, where he basically wants to understand why the KLF did a novelty pop song called As the Time Lords, in 1988. And so he writes this chapter basically talking about the importance of David Whitaker to Doctor Who, and from that, the importance of Doctor Who to popular culture in the 20th century. And he basically says David Whitaker has shaped popular culture in this country as we know it today, and nobody knows his name. And yet, in 2013, when the BBC made a drama about the creation of Doctor Who, An Adventure in Space and Time, David Whitaker's not in it. The reason for that is because there were lots of people who were involved in Doctor Who, and Mark Gatiss, who wrote it after extensive research, basically said there were too many people, so he condensed them down. And what he did was he took the associate producer, Mervyn Pinfield, who was responsible for a lot of the effects stuff, and he took David Whitaker, and he put them together as one character in that drama, and that's Mervyn Pinfield in the drama In the Glasses, second from the left. If you listen very carefully to Adventure in Space and Time, which is up on iPlayer, you can hear the words David Whitaker said at one point. But you have to listen very carefully for that, and that's part of your homework. But the BBC were aware of this absence, so when that drama was broadcast, they put up this on their website, it's still there, which is biographies of all the people who were involved in that first episode. People on the executive at the BBC, people who were in the drama department, people who were behind the scenes on the crew, and here's David. And Gary said David didn't have a York connection, but according to his biography on the BBC website, he did. Because according to them, while he was an actor at the York Repertory Group here, a play that he wrote was spotted by a BBC scout and he was offered a job, which is not true. And I became aware that there were things about David Whitaker that were not quite right, that got trotted out, and I wanted to investigate why that was and what was going on. And I thought in 2016, maybe if I did a bit of research, that would lead to a 5,000-word article for Doctor Who magazine. And things got a bit out of hand, and I ended up writing a 180,000-word book, because I found quite a lot. And what I found, I've started by going to the BBC's written archives in Reading, and I did that in lockdown, so you can see I'm very excited to be out of the house. And they keep paperwork on productions, and they keep paperwork on things like, so there was 3 files on David Whitaker's work that he'd done that were not in his 9-to-5 day job, so any extra work he did, they had a separate file for. They had files on Doctor Who, they had files on other programmes that he worked on, so I had to work out what other programmes he'd worked on and then check those. There were drama department minutes that he was in, there were script department minutes that he was in, various bits and pieces. You have to sort of think laterally to work out where you might spot his name and go through lots and lots of papers and find 1 or 2 things relating to him. And I went through as much of that as I could find, and I stuck it into a spreadsheet. I love a spreadsheet. And then I ran a data sort, so it was all in chronological order. And that gave me a chronology from which basically became the backbone of my book. So what did I find? The earliest paperwork is from 1956, a year before that play that was apparently done in York. And he submitted some short stories that he thought could be read on television, which was something that they did at the time. So a year before that play, he was actively pitching to the BBC. He continued pitching stuff to the BBC. There was a drama about road traffic safety. There was a musical. There were various other things. But in March 1957, he submitted a choice of partners which was specifically written for television. It says so on the front page, to the BBC. And that was broadcast in June. And the script, David's copy of the script is in that box over there. You can go and have a look at it. So where was he in York at the time? How does that overlap with his time in York? Well, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention another university in York, but St John's University in York has an archive of programmes from the Theatre Royal. And if you go through those, which I did, it gives you a timeline of when David Whitaker was here. So he was in plays in the summer of 1957, starting on the 6th of May, which probably means he arrived on the 1st of May to start rehearsals. He was here until the 1st of June and then stops. Why is that? Well, he had submitted and had accepted a choice of partners before he arrived in York. He then came to York and did 4 plays here as an actor, and then he left and I think went back to London because his TV play was being broadcast live and he was probably there for rehearsals and he probably watched it go out. And then when that was done, he had some meetings with the BBC about whether he'd write for them again. And they said, we've got a opening coming up for a 3-month contract in the script department. Why don't you apply for that? So while he was doing that and waiting for an okay, he came back to York in the summer. He's in the School for Scandal as part of the York Festival in the summer of 1957. Very well reviewed. People note how good he is in it as comedy. He stays through July, and in August he joins the BBC and is there until 1964. So that's what you learn from the archives. You can see these things happening. So then what I discovered, I made contact with David's family, and David's niece said, I've got 2 cardboard boxes in the loft of various photos, papers, bits and pieces. They're all a bit random. There were more, but there was a leak in the roof, and I threw a whole load of stuff away, which was a bit sad. So this random selection of material came my way, and I could then weave that into the timeline that I had, and that includes this. This is David on stage in York in 1957. He's the one on the left pouring the wine. But what this made me wonder was, why did the BBC think he had this play in York picked up by them? But why was he, that they thought he'd been spotted, but he was actively applying? And the reason for this mistake is that when David died in 1980, his wife sent out this press release, effectively, and she sent it to the BBC, she sent it to various newspapers, The Stage, she sent it to Doctor Who fanzines and things like that, and it says, quite categorically at the top, that he joined the BBC in 1957. This happened as a result of one of the stage plays David had written to be adapted. So that's where it comes from. His wife had got it wrong. And this is his wife, this is David and his wife, in a photo that belonged to June's cousin, who I spoke to. And interestingly, for me, as a researcher, it was held in this envelope underneath with a postmark on it saying who'd sent it. And I looked up 188 High Holborn, I think it is, in London, and that was the offices of TV Times Listings magazine. But the photo on the back of it had a stamp saying TV World, which, as I'm sure you will know, is the Anglia region version of TV Times from the mid-60s. So what you'd really want is an archive of those, which Birmingham Central Library has, which is bound volumes of TV World. So I spent a happy afternoon leafing through those until I found photos from that shoot. And there she is, there's June wearing, at the top, wearing the same distinctive T-shirt with a dragon on it, almost as if she knew archivists would be looking. And there's a bit of an interview with the famous actress from ITV Dramas and her writer husband there as a kind of celebrity couple. And in fact, that's in their flat in Russell Gardens Mews in London, where David would work. So that could be the table where he wrote his Doctor Who scripts and his novelisations. So that's kind of how I was working. And then to explore the sort of York connection, why did June think York was so important? This is a magazine that was published to commemorate 250 years of the Theatre Royal, which was shared with me by Mariska Schreiken, who's another archivist. And in it is this photo at the top of various people in the review that they did in Christmas 1959. And the reason for this photo being in there is quite a lot of these people went on to be quite famous. And between 1958 and 1960, there was a gang of actors in the same group. And in 1960, they all moved down to London to try their luck in television, and they all got there. So here's a close-up of them. That's June Barry, who married David Whitaker in 1963. That's Trevor Bannister, who was in Are You Being Served? Anybody know who that is? That's Hilda Ogden from Coronation Street. That's James Beck, who was Walker in Dad's Army. And this woman is less known now, but it's quite famous, quite well known by Doctor Who fans, is Alithia Charlton, who was in a lot of prestigious TV drama in the 60s and 70s, sadly died young in 1973. She was bridesmaid at David and June's wedding in the summer of 1963, and then 3 months later, she is the Lady Macbeth of the Cave People in the very first Doctor Who story, and is amazing. And I think David, being the story editor, crafting those scripts, editing those scripts to make them better, I would put money on him making that role really good, because he knew that his mate was going to be in it. So that connection from York was a big deal for June Barry, which is why she kind of applied that to David. But York ended up leading to this in Doctor Who. So once I was onto that, I was like, well, what else was David working on that can tell us about Doctor Who? Well, Doctor Who was not his first rodeo. He was also the original story editor on Compact, the BBC soap launched in 1962. Just over a year after Coronation Street had launched on ITV, and Compact was the BBC's answer to that. And it's made in a very different way from a BBC drama. Compared to the way BBC drama had been done before, it feels quite realistic, a bit kitchen sinky, it's a bit modern. It's about the team putting together a women's fashion magazine, and amazingly, in the first few episodes, they had real-life celebrities playing themselves, coming into the office to be interviewed and stuff, which gave it a bit of a zing about it. Episode 2, which survives and is on YouTube, was directed by a man called Christopher Barry, who then was the director of the first Dalek serial. So you can see Compact was where not just David, but other members of the Doctor Who team cut their teeth. In the summer of 1962, David moved from being story editor in the light entertainment department, where he worked on Compact, to being the story editor on the Sunday night play, the prestigious one-off dramas, where he did sorry, the typeface hasn't come out, but that's Bob Dylan, the arrow I was pointing to. This is Madhouse on Castle Street, on which David was story editor. The guy in the foreground is an actor called Reg Lai, an Australian actor, and the plot is that he's in a shared house in Manchester, which lots of misfits live in. He decides that he one day locks the door and leaves a note saying he's going to kill himself, and they all want to work out what they should do and should they break down the door. Reg Lai then plays a very similar character in the 1967-68 story, The Enemy of the World, written by David Whitaker. So you can see the influence of that. But while David was working on this, he wrote a 12-page paper on how the Sunday night play could up its ratings in the wake of its enemy on ITV. This man, not the dog, Bruce Forsyth. Because Bruce Forsyth presented Sunday night at the London Palladium, very, very popular Sunday show. And because of the huge audience for that, the show that followed it on ITV, Armchair Theatre, one-off plays, did very well. And David wrote this paper going, well, there are things that we could do to emulate that success. And Sunday night at the London Palladium was a variety show, so it had comedy, and it had songs, and it had games, but each week had a structure. So first, like the bit with the dog, there'd be a bit of a comedy shtick, there might be a stand-up comic, there might be a minor band doing funny songs. It would then get members of the audience up onto the stage to play a funny game, and you'd kind of be rooting for them. And then it'd be time for the advert break, and Bruce Forsyth would say, don't go away, because when we come back, we've got something special. And that might be the Beatles, or a Hollywood star, or Cilla Black. Big names, big, big names. And what that meant was that the show was different every week, and yet you knew what you were getting. Amazing thing to do. And in 1963, the guy who was in charge of Armchair Theatre on ITV, who benefited from this, he moved over to become head of drama at the BBC. He helped create, he co-created Doctor Who, and David was made story editor, and they tried to apply some of that lesson so that the first year of Doctor Who, they go through all of time and space, but that year of Doctor Who, the episodes are really consistent. Even though they go to the far future and go to history and go to meet the Aztecs and the French Revolution and wear some amazing, amazing hats. Each week, it feels the same. The characters feel the same. The situations feel the same. The tone of it is very consistent. So you knew what you were going to get. And that really helped embed it as a hit. And also, David, when they were kind of going in the early days, trying to work out what the stories should be, they were pitched this original Dalek story, and David said, that is the tone, that is the feel of it. We want it to be fast, fast-moving, full of jeopardy, full of excitement, and some really great ideas that will scare the pants out of kids. And that made it a hit. The archive, so that's the beginnings of Doctor Who. The archive also includes what happened at the end of David's time on Doctor Who. So this is a piece from the Sunday Times, playwrights who see red on the top left. This is about David's trip to Moscow in the summer of 1969 on behalf of the Writers' Guild of Great Britain, where there was an international writers' congress, and David was briefed to find a way to protest the treatment of Solzhenitsyn, who the Soviet Union had kind of had targeted at the time. And David found a way to do that. He added an item on the agenda on the day, came back feeling he'd done the right thing, and isn't he clever? And all hell broke loose. There were people who thought he'd gone too far. There were people who thought he hadn't gone far enough. There were people who thought that even by going to Moscow, he was endorsing the Soviet regime. So that was in July 1969. In May, it is still making headlines. And this is the newspaper thing that refers to David as a traitor. And he then presented his case to the Writers Guild at their AGM in May, so it's still rumbling on almost a year after he left. And he basically says this whole thing it's left his dad in tears, it's left his wife in tears. He's persona non grata at certain television companies. He is being told that he shouldn't work for places. Turns out the poison pen letter campaign was going on. They sent letters to Crossroads. They sent letters to the Doctor Who production office. And that coincided with David being taken off his final Doctor Who story. He delivered 3 episodes of The Ambassadors of Death, and then they handed it over to another writer. But when that story went out, it did very well. It got the highest viewing figures of the year. And the script editor at the time wrote David a letter saying, now that the tumult and shouting had died, implying that there had been tumult and shouting, I thought you'd like to know that your episodes have done really well, and as it says in the second paragraph, I'm convinced that the success was down to your original storyline. And that's written by Terrance Dix, hand-signed, and it's an olive branch, because the week that this was happening, Terrance was working out who was going to write the next year of Doctor Who, so I think if David had replied, he would have worked on Doctor Who in 1971, and it wouldn't have all come to an end. But he didn't. And the BBC have a copy of this letter in the file on the Ambassadors of Death, and there's no reply. If there had been a reply, it would have gone on file. So David doesn't look like he sent the reply. But this, and it's in the box over there, is the original letter that David kept. It's one of the few items relating to Doctor Who that he kept. And it's in pristine nick, which means it must have meant something to him. It was important to him. And in later years, he and Terrance kind of made it up. And in the late 70s, they were working on a project together. So that's kind of what the archive tells us about David. Then there's Terrance, who was the script editor. He'd just become script editor at the time of that letter. But he had a huge career on Doctor Who. So top left, that's Patrick Troughton's last story, co-written by Terrance. That's where they introduced the concept of the Time Lords. Top right, that's a Doctor Who story where the monster looks like a willy and a curtain, which just entertained Terrance a lot. I've just been reading the interview where he talks about that. Bottom left, Terrance wrote Tom Baker's first story as Doctor Who, and the companion is Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith. Terrance helped create that character. And then bottom right is Terrance wrote The 5 Doctors for the 20th anniversary special. Some of you who can count will notice there's only 4 Doctors in that. That's because Terrance wrote a script for all 5 Doctors, and then Tom Baker said, you know what, I don't want to be in it. And Terrance had to rewrite it at the last minute and make it work, and blimey, he made it work. He was amazing at that sort of thing. You gave him a crisis, and he'd make it look simple. So those are the stories that he wrote, all up on iPlayer. Brain and Morbius is credited to a pseudonym, because he and the script editor at the time fell out over it. Which means that he's the credited writer on 27 episodes, if you include the Brain and Morbius. He also is uncredited on rewriting quite a lot of the Seeds of Death and some other stuff. I think pretty much all the John Pertwee episodes he would have done a polish on, because he was a script editor in that period, 156 episodes, 64 novelizations, more than anybody else. So 64 of about 150 20th century Doctor Who stories he novelized, 13 original novels, 6 non-fiction books, 2 stage plays, 3 audiobooks and plays. And you can see, compared to David Whitaker, it's not all Daleks. It's a real spread of doctors, of periods of time, of everything, really varied. This, just part of his very successful TV career. He worked on The Avengers in the 60s. He worked on Crossroads, both as a writer and a storyliner, giving plots to other people. He helped create with Barry Letts, a sci-fi series called Moonbase 3, and he wrote an episode and script edited it. He worked on Space 1999, the Jerry Anderson series, and then in the 80s, he was script editor and producer on more than 100 episodes of the classic serials. That includes Timothy Dalton in Jane Eyre. That includes the 16-episode version of Vanity Fair. It includes an amazing, amazing version of Oliver Twist from 1985. And all of that while he published 236 books. Over 40 years, that's 6.5 books a year. That is If he'd just done that, that would be amazing. But he did that around this extraordinarily prolific TV career. Plus, he had a career in radio. Plus, he was writing short stories and articles and straight-to-videos. And he was always at Doctor Who conventions giving interviews. He was in magazines. He was in books. He's in documentaries on the TV and on radio and on the DVDs. You can't really escape him. And as a result, whereas David Whitaker had 2 cardboard boxes of archives, when I went to Terrance's house after he died, there were boxes everywhere. And that photo that Gary showed earlier of his office, that was when they cleared out all the boxes of paperwork. But the top floor of his house was full of these boxes and boxes of paper. And Elsa, when I asked Elsa, his widow, what she'd like to happen to those boxes, she said, well, I'd like, I'm very pleased that you're coming here to have a look through them and whatever. You're not the only person who's been, and I'd like to make that accessible and for somebody just to look after these things. And she said, what I really need is a knight in shining armour who's sat over there, and who came and made it all very simple. And she was so delighted, so delighted. So I thought I would write a book on Terrance as well. And the thing is that Terrance gave lots and lots of interviews, but he tended to have a number of stories and anecdotes that would come round again and again. For example, he would say, the War Games, the last Patrick Troughton story. He was sat in the office and the producer came in and said, we've had a 4-part story collapse and a 6-part story collapse. You need to write a 10-part story and we need it next week. And Terrance loved telling that story. And he loved to say, and it's not very good. And then whoever was interviewing him would go, no, Terrance, it's brilliant. And he'd go, well, if you say so. He loved doing that over and over again. And I thought, well, as he did it over and over again, he probably polished that story over the years. So what I need to do as a researcher is find the earliest iterations of his interviews, because those early versions of the anecdote will be the least polished and the most true versions. And actually, what I found is the opposite. Because when Terrance was interviewed in the 70s and 80s, he was still working for the BBC. He was still working with a lot of the people that he was talking about. So he tended to be self-effacing, but he tended to be quite guarded and polite. And then in the last decade of his life, from about 2000, the kind of brakes came off. And he tended to tell you what he thought and felt and what he thought about people. And there was a weird thing, because I interviewed him on stage in 2010, and he would gravitate towards the greatest hits anecdotes, and it'd be quite difficult to steer him. So what you needed, really, was an interviewer who had time to talk to him, so not a 10-minute interview, but an hour-long interview, who also knew the stuff he'd said before and could dig a little deeper. And what that means is there's a handful of interviews from the end of his life, from the last decade, where you get some really good stuff. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So one of them is a man called Gareth Kavanagh was doing a publication about the Doctor Who books, and he interviewed Terrance and said, the thing about those Doctor Who novelizations is there's a whole generation of us who grew up on these books and reread them. Did you have books like that in your life? And Terrance said, yes, Kim by Rudyard Kipling, which he'd mentioned before in interviews, but not quite to the extent that this is how much it meant to him. And also a book that I'd not heard of before, called Beleriand by Raphael Sabatini, which is, they're both stories about sort of teenage boys who are a bit smart alecky and play off, they have adventures and they kind of play off other people by being a bit smart and brave and quirky and fun. And when I read them, I was like, oh, I can see quite a lot of Doctor Who, or Terrance's Doctor Who in this. I mean, Kim is a boy who he's kind of in two worlds. He spends half his life working for a colonel in the British Army on secret intelligence, and the other half following around a Tibetan monk who's in charge of who's looking for the real place that he's seen in a dream, which is a kind of like what I imagine John Pertwee was doing as a child as Doctor Who, if you've seen Planet of the Spiders or The Time Monster. It's a very similar kind of mentality. And the thing about these books is Terrance was reading a lot from an early age, which a lot of people did. But in 1946, when he turned 11, the Butler Act had just come in, and he sat the 11 plus. He was in the second year to do the 11 plus. And his reading led him to grammar school. And then, because he was a bit quirky and cheeky, like his heroes in his books. He got into trouble for flicking elastic bands at another student, and the headmaster set him an essay on the proper use of elastic. And Terrance, being Terrance, wrote a quirky, funny essay in response. Sadly, it doesn't survive. But his headmaster was so impressed about this funny essay that he put him on the fast-track scholarship programme, and Terrance ended up going to Downing College, Cambridge, which is where this photo is taken from. Working-class boy goes to Downing College and on to the BBC. Great story of social mobility. Then my friend Toby Haydock asked Terrance about Cambridge and how it had influenced his life, because he said you were tutored by F.R. Leavis, the author of The Great Tradition, who had some views on English literature, and then you ended up as the script editor and producer on the classic serials. So I can see a line on that. What was your time at Cambridge like? And Terrance said, well, I just mucked about, to be honest. But unlike at school, nobody cared what I did, as long as at the end of the year I sat the exams and passed. And he did that each year, and at the end of 3 years, he scraped through. And he went to the board where all the exam marks were put up and discovered he had a 2-2, and he was rather chuffed by that. And then he told Toby this. Afterwards, I met my tutor, and he said, I'm sorry to hear about your results, Mr. Dix. And I said, well, I wasn't. I thought I did far better than I deserved. And he said, so do I. And that made me think of something that Terrance had told me. Because we did Doctor Who magazine did a special on the Master a decade ago. And Terrance had helped create the Master. And I'd asked how that had happened. And he said, well, the thing was that John Pertwee's Doctor was very authoritative, and he could talk over the tops of people, and monsters tended to quiver and stuff. So what we needed was a villain who was kind of the Doctor's equal and could stand his own. And he said, we were kind of talking about the John Pertwee Doctor as a kind of Sherlock Holmes. So, said Barry Letts, the producer, what we need is a Moriarty. And Letts said, I know who we can get to play that, because there's this actor that I used to work with who's brilliant at playing villains. And he can be smart, he can be smooth and sophisticated and also sinister, a man called Roger Delgado. And Terrance came back in the morning and said, I know what we're going to call him. We're going to call him the Master. Because that comes from the Master of Cambridge College, the person who's in charge of the doctors, so that gives him a bit of authority. But it also has the right overtones of dominance, villainy, and conceit, Terrance told me. And I thought, because of what Toby had got out of Terrance about his time at Downing, Terrance was in trouble at Cambridge for not doing any work. Did he get sent to see the Master at Cambridge? And who was that? So, W.K.C. Guthrie, Professor of Ancient Philosophy, author of a History of Greek Philosophy, lovely man by all accounts, rather softly spoken, not really master material. But he didn't arrive at Downing College until April 1957, 2 months before Terrance left, so it's not him. He succeeded a man who died at the end of 1956, who's this guy, Sir Lionel Whitby. And Lionel Whitby, he was an amazing life story. He was horribly wounded in the First World War, ended up going through lots of operations and stuff, and as a result of this, became very interested in the science and the practicalities of blood transfusions, and became a leading expert on this. He wrote the sort of definitive study of the time, Disorders of the Blood. His patients included the King, Winston Churchill, all sorts of famous people. He was very charming, very hard-working, very diligent, but because he worked in blood, people found him a bit sinister. And when he died, one of the College of Surgeons, their obituary referred to him as the vampire. Was this the guy that Terrance got sent to for not doing any work? And did that then lead to this, which is obviously another academic? Or is he? Because that's the Master. And I think, so Terrance's time at Cambridge ended up in the Master, but also what's going on here is, this is the Radio Times to promote Terror of the Autons, the first story of 1971. And what they did in that season was to surround the Doctor with a regular cast of characters. So as well as the Brigadier and new companion Jo Grant and the Master, they also have some regular characters in unit, that's Captain Yates and Sergeant Benson, to sort of round things out. And that's something that Terrance had learnt on Crossroads, which is that to take the pressure off the lead actor, you share screen time with other regular actors who the audience becomes familiar with. And what worked to take the pressure off Meg Richardson as Noel Gordon as Meg Richardson was the same for John Pertwee as Doctor Who. So this story is mixing Terrance's time at Cambridge, high culture, with his time on Crossroads, low culture, and they're stirring in plastics factory that Terrance lived by a plastics factory for a while during the war. They're throwing in some ideas from Star Trek. There's a circus in it, everything you want. And it's all stirred into the mix. And that's how Terrance worked on Doctor Who. And it means it's really full of excitement and adventure and things. It appeals to everyone. The other thing that I was really interested in this is, and I'm aware we're a bit short time, so I'm going to hurry through this, but Terrance worked in advertising in the early 60s, and he learned a lot as an advertising copywriter on TV ads. He didn't talk about this very much. He tended to say that he worked on dog food and shampoo commercials, and that was it. But in chatting to his widow, we think he worked on Imperial Leather. And this is a magazine advert from just before he started. This is from 58, and he started in 59. And look at how it's written. There's the first line, the waltz came in a whirl of naughtiness. It's vivid, it's conjuring an atmosphere, it's immediately grabbing your attention. There's a word, 3 lines from the bottom, super fatted soap, 1 word. That's not a word, they've made that up. But it catches the eye, it kind of gets your attention. It's all very vivid and all very exciting. And I think Terrance, having learnt to do writing of this sort, put that into his books. And that's what we can see here. This is a draft of, let's lay this on the line, of the greatest opening sentence in all of literature. Through the ruins of a city, there stalked the ruin of a man, from Doctor Who and the Dalek Invasion of Earth. And you can see him working out how to get this across vividly and emotively, and it's the most exciting stuff. And this stuff was really, really potent. Mark Gatiss, the writer and actor, said that as a kid, he went to the garden centre in Darlington, and there was a stand of Doctor Who books, and by begging his parents, he got the 3 Doctors, which he read in an afternoon. And it was full of words that he'd never heard before, like capacious. That's actually from Terrance's 3rd book, Doctor Who and the Abominable Snowman. He describes the Doctor's pockets as capacious, and as I'm sure you all know, capacious is from Dickens. Fuzzy-Wig in A Christmas Carol has a capacious waistcoat. But Mark says, really importantly, we weren't a bookish household, it wasn't a bookish world, and yet this led Mark to becoming a great reader, and in fact, Bookish, the detective series that he created and stars in. And because this year is the year of reading, and there's a big tension, there's big concern about teenage boys especially not reading, it's interesting that in the archive, we can find Terrance talking about exactly this. And he said that what was really important, and what we can see him working out in these drafts, is readability, and the idea of the kid as customer. And that you want to give them what they want to read, which is a very advertising way of approaching this. And his editor asked about this. His editor, Brenda Gardner, who was the editor on these Doctor Who books and then went on to set up her own Piccadilly Press, which published more than 100 books by Terrance. She said the important thing for children is short books, because it's a real achievement if they get to the end of a book, but also it really helps if it's a character that they already know, because that takes them through the book. And that's what the Doctor Who books did. They're short, 128 pages, 114 pages in some cases. Terrance was always keen to keep the word count down. But also, you'd be reading books where you already knew the characters from screen. You may be reading a book of a story you'd seen on screen. And that gave you an advantage as a young reader starting out to get through them. And what that means is that these books really appealed to young children, but they tended to outstrip them. They tended to go further and read the more complicated Doctor Who books and then more complicated sci-fi stuff. And I have spoken to loads of people since it was announced that I was doing this book who've told me that this was the story of their lives. And Terrance acknowledged this. He said, you can start with me, start with Dicks and work up to Dickens, as long as you get them reading. And I realised that what that means is that his Doctor Who on TV, his books, his time on the classic serials was him trying to share what he had benefited from as a kid, which is that reading took him out into the universe. A bit like this. Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you. That's absolutely riveting. I'm sure you all agree. We have got some time for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, you just want to stick your hand in the air. Someone will come round with a microphone for you. Please do speak into the microphone so everybody here and in the future can hear you. I think you take first place. Thank you.
So one of the early slides was a script for the 6 Doctors. I wonder where that fits in.
Right. I've been told not to mention this, so just between ourselves and YouTube. Terrance told me, and other people, that nothing survived of his original draft of the 5 Doctors from before Tom Baker said, when they thought Tom Baker was going to be in it. It turns out that's not true. Something survives, and I'm not allowed to say anything else yet. But there will be announcements in due course.
That does deserve an ooh. Yes.
But yes, when I was going through those boxes of things and I found that, I was on the phone to people.
Yeah.
And they had to go, can you breaking the sound barrier. But yes, it's very exciting.
It is. It is.
And it's not what I thought. So it was called The 6 Doctors because he took over from Robert Holmes, who was going to write it first, and pitched a story where there was a fake doctor. And Terrance inherited the title. And Terrance would say, I didn't change much when I rewrote it. He rewrote quite a lot. So it's not a complete script, but there's enough of it, and there's notes and bits of other things so that we can put something together. But more to come on that.
Okay. Oh, we've got a question there.
Hello. I was quite intrigued that David Whitaker was blacklisted after he went on this Writers' Guild visit to Russia. I mean, was it simply because of how it was handled or how he handled it?
The blacklisting of David Whitaker is really, it's really upsetting, for one thing. But yes, he seems to have, in a kind of, he seems to have upset all sides by what was it. I don't think he had any choice in what he did. I actually think his account of what he did makes a lot of sense. But he was given a kind of impossible brief, which was to go to Moscow and raise the issue when the authorities running that Congress had said, we are not discussing this issue. It's off the table. So if anybody raises it, it'll be vetoed. So he raises it and then causes a stink, and then they kind of have this agreement to back away. But the left are not pleased, the right are not pleased, the centrists are not pleased. It's an amazing thing to kind of watch people who you would expect to be natural enemies kind of coming together to condemn this. But it's also to do with whether the Writers' Guild should take that kind of political stance on issues or whether they should just be negotiating for contracts. That was another thing that people felt it was stepping outside of its bands. And then I've spoken to people who said what you also have to remember is that there was an awful lot of drinking going on in TV and writing generally. So people were quite drunk and cross quite a lot of the time anyway. But it was horrible. And I've spoken to people who received the poison pen letters calling him a traitor, that he shouldn't be working in television. He had documented some of it. And he and his wife, so his wife was in the Forsyte Saga, which was a massive drama. And then she didn't have any telework for a year. So they were both affected by this. And they ended up going to Australia. She was invited out to be in a stage production in Australia. And they went. And when by the time the play ended, he'd got some work in Australia. So he stayed for 6-7 years, kind of until it blew over. But he never worked in television again. It's really, really sad.
Because I did hear that he did come back to this country in the late 70s, and I think he wasn't planning to novelise some of his Doctor Who stories before he died.
Yes, so he came back in 76 or 77. He was looking around for work. Ernest Maxim, the producer of Morecambe and Wise, and he were working on some stuff together, various other things. And then he signed a contract in December 1979 to novelise The Evil of the Daleks, and he was also working on The Enemy of the World, and sadly he died of cancer in February 1980, so he just missed the boat, sadly. But the first page of his novelisation of The Enemy of the World survived. That was one of the things in the boxes that his niece had. And it's great. I would put money on the fact that he had read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, which came out in September 1979 and was written. Douglas Adams was another former script editor of Doctor Who, and I think David tried to emulate the same comic tone. So it begins from the TARDIS's point of view, which is great, really good, and very sad that we didn't get more of it.
Thank you.
Just pick up on that, just chair's privilege. When it comes to The Enemy of the World novelisation, there are changes. Like he has a covering letter, because I was reading this yesterday, where he says there are certain characters that I've dropped from the story for clarity. One of them's the Doctor's companion, Victoria.
Yes.
So both, and I think it's something you said to me as well, is that both Terrance and David, the archives show how they tweaked everything when they came to things like novelising. So Terrance, for instance, when he's working with other people's scripts.
Yes. Yeah, there's lots of, the changes are really interesting and what their focus is. So David was commissioned to novelise The Enemy of the World and then The Evil of the Daleks, in that order. But they'd been broadcast the other way round, and the Evil of the Daleks introduced the companion of Victoria, who's then in The Enemy of the World. So David, because he wasn't thinking, oh, these need to be a record of TV episodes, he thought, well, I'm going to need to take Victoria out of the first one, because she's then introduced in the second one. So it's quite logical. But also, The Enemy of the World was based on a visual gag, which is that the TARDIS arrives in Australia in the space year 2018, and the dictator who's holding the world to ransom looks just like the Doctor, because he's played by Patrick Troughton. And the idea is that some freedom fighters basically say, why don't you dress up as the dictator of the world and you can help us stop him? That doesn't work in prose. So David also replotted, because he's outlined for how he was going to approach the book survives, so he replotted the story to make that work. So there's a lot more work in this than I think it's not just you get the script of the TV episode and write it down. There's a lot of editorial and a lot of things to build pace and get some character into it and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think from working with the archive, one of my favourite examples with Terrance Dicks is the way he bookends the Pyramids of Mars.
Oh, yeah. So the Pyramids of Mars, really good Doctor Who story from 1975, and he novelises it in 76. And it's about an Egyptian god who's going to destroy the world. And so he begins with a prologue that gives you the history of the Egyptian gods according to Doctor Who. So it's set thousands of years ago, and it's epic in scale, and the BBC could not afford to do that. But between that TV serial being on and the book coming out, Liz Sladen had left Doctor Who as Sarah Jane Smith. So Terrance acknowledges that by having a bookend where Sarah, having left the TARDIS, goes to the house that she visited in 1911 to find out what the news... And she checks the local newspaper, because she's a journalist. She checks the local newspaper to see what it says, and it tells you the names of some of the characters who died, because we only got their surnames. It tells you bits of detail about it and how kind of history absorbed it. So it manages to be about how history absorbs events, but it's also about perspective. And so it's great.
Yeah.
Really, really good.
Yeah. I think you said you've had a feeling that Terrance tweaked everything that he novelised as well. Yeah,
he had a real logical mind for plot, and he was really good at fixing things in stories that didn't work. And so he did that as a script editor on the scripts that came his way. And then as a noveliser, he'd get scripts to novelise and he would fix them. My favourite example is the android invasion, where it just kind of runs out of steam and stops, and the Doctor defeats the monster. And you go, but hang on, isn't there an invasion fleet? And aren't people tied up in there and whatever? And Terrance just adds a sort of paragraph. He goes, the Doctor still had to deal with the army and deal with this and deal with that, blah, blah, blah. And then it's the last sentence is just, but otherwise, the android invasion was over.
Any other questions? Yes, got a gentleman at the front here.
Thanks very much. That was great, really interesting. I had a question about Terrance's work on the classic serials in the 80s. I was really impressed by the work he did there, but I don't remember him talking about it very much, and I just wondered if some of his early literary interests had reflected in the choices of those classic serials, or if he didn't really have much involvement over which ones were going to be featured.
So the classic serials in the 1980s, they were dramatisations of books. The BBC had been doing this since 1938 when they did Pride and Prejudice, and then it became a fixture of the Sunday tea time schedule from about 1950. And you get, Jane Austen in 5 or 6 episodes, and then Dickens in 5 or 6 episodes, and sometimes they'd be longer and sometimes they'd be shorter. By 1980, the pattern was that they did stuff that was out of copyright, so anything up to about 1900. And Terrance came in with Great Expectations, which was commissioned by Alistair Bell, who'd been on classic serials for a decade, and Terrance came in to oversee that, and then stayed. So it's the serials after that that really show his involvement. There's a lot of paperwork in his archive coming up with ideas for what they could adapt. And what's really interesting is he goes for 20th century authors. So they do Stalky and Company by Kipling. They do The Hound of the Baskervilles by Conan Doyle. Now, those were written at the end or the 19th century, but early 20th century. But these are authors who died in the 1930s, so they were still in copyright. He also expands that to include thrillers. So they do 2 Josephine Tay novels. One of them, Brat Farah, they set in the 1980s. They make it contemporary. It has a kind of Rivals feel about it a bit. And they do the Diary of Anne Frank as well, which is not a novel. So he's playing with what the canon of literature is in ways that I think would have made F.R. Leavis's head spin. And I think, actually, Terrance's time on classic serials may have been 2 fingers up at F.R. Leavis. It's also interesting what they don't do. Terrance didn't think George Eliot worked on television, although his predecessor had done The Mill on the Floss. He didn't do Conrad, who was one of the... No Conrad, no Henry James, which F.R. Leavis had of his 4 authors who were in the Great Tradition. They didn't do Austen because they'd done a lot of Austen in the 70s, I think. And there's no D.H. Lawrence, who F.R. Leavis loved. Probably not suitable for tea time on Sundays. But they did a version of The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells that was thought so shocking by BBC management that they postponed it and put it out on Tuesday evenings because they thought it was too disturbing. So yeah, he was really pushing what you could and couldn't do. And the lists of potential books are really interesting. And also they did things like The Prisoner of Zenda, I think, because... Terrance had novelised The Androids of Tara, which is a Doctor Who story that's a massive rip-off of The Prisoner of Zenda. About a year later, he went, The Prisoner of Zenda would be a good one to do as a classic serial. And then he was working on The Five Doctors, and there was a character that he wanted to use from a previous serial called the Lady Thalia, who's a time lady, and they couldn't get the rights, or they didn't want to pay for the rights to that, so he changes the name to Lady Flavia, which is a character in The Prisoner of Zenda. So you can see that the way these things all bleed into each other, and watching the classic serials, you realise it's all the same actors as well, which is amazing. There's one bit where Julian Glover, who is Scaroth in The City of Death, he's playing Mr. Dombey in Dombey and Son, and his servant is Kenton, but he's the guy whose arm is wrapped in green bubble wrap in the Ark in Space. And it's great to see, and then in comes Paul Darrow from Blake Seven, who steals and it's like there's some proper Doctor Who villain acting all hitting at the same time in a Dickensian adaptation. It's amazing.
Love it. I'm afraid to say, and I'm not slightly ironically, that time is against us. In a session to do time travel, it seems a bit unfair, but there we are. I'd just like to invite everybody to give their thanks to Simon for an excellent talk and for answering all those questions. I am very sure that some of you today, or many of you today, would like to buy a copy of Simon's book on David Whitaker. There are some for sale outside, and you are going to be signing some if anyone...
I've also brought some copies of... These 2 are books where my pitch for this one was to basically say to the editors, I don't know what this book's going to be. but I'm going to do some research. I'm going to go to the BBC's archives, and I'm going to go to other archives to research the evil of the Daleks and see where it takes me. And so that's the result of that book. And then that one is a book where there's no production file for a William Hartnell Doctor Who story. So how do you research a story where there's no paperwork? And what I realised was you have to kind of trace the fuzzy out edges of what we do know and then make some deductions about what's on the inside. So that's what I did.
The joy of archival research and rent in tooth and claw. It's a Doctor Who story. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your festival. There's plenty more events to go to. If you hopefully you're already booked on. If you would like to see any elements from the Terrance Dix and David Whitaker archives, this little wooden case here has some examples in it. But other than that, thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming, and see you again in the future. Thank you.